April o 1945, Bergen-Belsen Camp, Germany. British tanks rolled through the gates, anticipating a victory, but finding thousands of Jews and prisoners who had survived the systematic machinery of Nazi extermination and concentration camps across Europe. Instead of the glory of liberation, they found a literal hell on earth. The smell hit the soldiers first. A thick, suffocating wall of death and disease that made grown men, hardened by years of war, fall to their knees and vomit. Bodies lay stacked like firewood between the barracks, creating a grotesque architecture of death that defied all human reason. 000 people, more skeleton than human, stumbled through mud mixed with human waste. This was Bergen-Belsen, and this was liberation. The numbers told a story that words could not, painting a picture of suffering so vast it eclipsed the imagination. In the first week after British and Canadian forces arrived, the horror did not end. It accelerated. 400 people died every single day. They did not die from Nazi bullets, nor from the gas chambers that had claimed millions before them. They died after being saved. They died in the arms of their rescuers, turning the joy of freedom into a bitter, tragic irony. Medical teams worked around the clock, enslaved by their own protocols, doing everything right, according to their training. Yet each morning brought wagons full of fresh corpses, a relentless harvest of death. The death count climbed past 2, ling ling ling, then dry, ling ling ling, then fear, ling ling ling. At this catastrophic rate, British commanders made a dark, pragmatic calculation. Censure, 000. More would die within the next 2 months. Even with the best medical care the Allied forces could provide, the mathematics of survival had turned against them. The conventional approach seemed obvious to every trained doctor in the camp. It was a doctrine of caution. Feed the starving slowly. Give them clean water. Treat their diseases. Keep them warm and comfortable. Let their bodies recover at a natural log. Gentle pace. This was medical science proven over decades of practice in hospitals and battlefields alike. Army doctors had saved thousands of wounded soldiers using these exact methods. There was no logical reason it should not work here. But it was not working. In fact, it was killing them. Prisoners who ate their first real meal in months died within hours, their shrunken stomachs going into shock, unable to handle the sudden intake of nutrients. Others drank too much water too fast, and their hearts simply stopped, overwhelmed by the volume. Typhus spread through the crammed barracks faster than doctors could treat it, leaping from host to host in the filth. The medicine was right. The food was right. The water was clean. Everything was being done correctly by the book. Yet people kept dying in numbers that shocked even hardened combat veterans. The rulebook was failing because the game had changed. Senior medical officers held meeting after meeting in their command tents, desperate for a solution. They reviewed charts and discussed treatment plans. Analyzing the disaster through the lens of traditional medicine, they brought in more supplies, more doctors, more nurses. Nothing changed. A British colonel finally stood before his staff and said the words nobody wanted to hear, admitting a terrifying defeat. These losses are inevitable. Given the condition these people are in, we should consider ourselves fortunate if half of them survive. We are doing all we can. The experts had spoken. The best minds in military medicine had reached their conclusion. Censure. 000. More deaths were simply the price of liberation, a tragic but unavoidable outcome written in the statistics. The doctors would continue their work, follow their training, and accept what they believed they could not change. Lieutenant Colonel Ben Dunkelman stood in the freezing mud of Bergen-Belsen and refused to accept this verdict. He was 28 years old, a Canadian officer who had fought his way across Europe from the beaches of D-Day to this miserable place. He was not a doctor. He had no medical training whatsoever. He was a soldier, nothing more. But he was also Jewish, and the people dying in front of him were his people. Every hollow face reminded him of his grandmother, his cousins, The families he knew back home in Toronto. He watched them die, and something inside him broke. Dunkelman walked through the camp for hours, ignoring the stench, forcing himself to look at the reality the charts ignored. He saw the barracks where 50 people shared space meant for 10, breathing the same infected air. He saw the single water pump serving thousands. He saw the medical tent where doctors treated patients one by one, carefully and slowly, while hundreds waited outside in the cold to die. He saw the system, and he finally understood why it was failing. The camp itself was the weapon. That night, he sat in his tent and wrote notes by lamplight. His hands shook, not from the biting cold, but from a righteous anger. The military was trying to save individuals when they needed to save a population. Every protocol, every procedure, every rule in the medical handbook was designed for normal situations, for sterile hospitals and manageable wounds. This was not normal. This was 30, 0, 0, 0. People dying because the rulebook did not have a chapter for hell. The idea came to him fully formed. So simple and so dangerous that he almost dismissed it himself. Move them, all of them. Get them out of this death trap and spread them across a dozen locations where they could be properly cared for. Move the sickest first, the ones most likely to die if they stayed another day in these conditions. Move them fast. Move them now. Move them, even if the moving itself was risky. He knew exactly what the doctors would say. Moving critically ill patients was dangerous. The stress of transport could kill them instantly. Better to keep them stable and treat them where they were. This was basic medical knowledge, taught to every first-year nursing student. But Dunkelman looked at his notes and saw the flaw in their logic. 400 deaths per day. That was the cost of keeping them stable. That was the price of following the rules. He made his decision. Tomorrow, he would present his plan to the senior officers. He expected them to laugh at him, maybe threaten him with discipline for wasting their time. He was just a combat officer with a crazy idea, going up against trained medical experts who had forgotten more about medicine than he would ever know. But he had one advantage the experts did not have. He had nothing to lose. The doctors had their reputations, their protocols, their professional pride. Dunkelman had only the faces of the dying, and the unshakable belief that watching people die while following the rules was not medicine. It was just slow murder with paperwork. The lamp flickered in his tent, casting long shadows. Outside, another night fell on Bergen-Belsen. In the morning, 400 more would be dead, unless someone did something impossible. The next morning, Dunkelman walked into the command meeting with a folder full of numbers and a plan that would likely get him court-martialed. The tent was packed with British officers, medical staff, and logistics commanders. Maps covered every table. Charts showed death rates climbing like a fever that would not break. He waited for his turn to speak, watching seasoned doctors shake their heads at problems that seemed to have no solutions. When he stood up, the room went quiet. He was the junior officer here, the Canadian, with no medical background trying to lecture the experts. He opened his folder and began, his voice cutting through the defeatism. We need to move 34. 000. People out of this camp within 72 hours. The silence broke into laughter, then angry murmurs, then outright dismissal. A British medical colonel stood up, his face red with indignation. You want to move dying patients? You will kill them faster than the typhus. Sit down, Lieutenant Colonel. Leave medicine to the doctors. Dunkelman did not sit down. He pulled out his first page of calculations, using their own data against them. Right now, 400 people die here every day. That is a 12% daily death rate. If we move them to clean facilities with proper spacing, even if we lose 3% during transport, we still save 9%. That is 360 lives per day. Every day we wait, we lose those lives. His voice was steady, but his hands gripped the folder tight enough to crumple the pages. The medical staff pushed back hard. Moving critical patients required ambulances, trained transport teams, proper equipment. They had none of that. The roads were damaged from war, The weather was cold and wet. Patients would die in the backs of trucks, bouncing over rough roads, bleeding out or going into shock before reaching any destination. It was madness. It was logistically impossible. It was medically irresponsible. Dunkelman asked for one chance to prove his theory. Give me 500 of the sickest patients. Give me whatever trucks you can spare. Let me move them 15 kilometers to the nearest town with intact buildings. If I am wrong, I will never question medical decisions again. The room erupted in arguments. Finally, a single voice cut through the noise. Brigadier Glenn Hughes, Deputy Director of Medical Services, stepped forward. He was a career military doctor who had seen every kind of battlefield horror. He looked at Dunkelman, then at the death rate charts, then back at Dunkelman. You get your test. 500 patients. 24 hours to show results. If your death rate is higher than ours, this conversation ends forever. The next morning, Dunkelman commandeered every vehicle he could find. German army trucks, abandoned ambulances, even a few civilian buses left behind in the chaos. He gathered medical orderlies, nurses, and volunteers who were willing to try something insane. The plan was precise. Each patient would get exactly 1,200 calories of food before transport, spread over 6 small meals to prevent shock. Water would be rationed at half a liter every 2 hours. No exceptions. Bodies needed fuel before they could handle the stress of movement. They loaded the first truck at dawn. Patients so thin their bones showed through skin like shadows. Many could not walk. Volunteers carried them on stretchers, moving as gently as possible over ground that offered no gentleness. Each truck held 20 people, packed with blankets and hot water bottles. Medical staff rode along, monitoring vital signs, ready to stop if anyone crashed. The 15-kilometer journey took 3 hours. Trucks moved at walking speed over roads cratered by bombs and tanks. Every bump brought gasps of pain from the cargo beds. Twice, they had to stop when patients needed emergency care. Dunkelman rode in the lead vehicle, checking his watch every few minutes, calculating mortality rates in his head like a man counting down to his own execution. The tension was unbearable. Every jolt of the truck felt like a potential death sentence. They reached the town by noon. Empty German barracks became instant hospitals. The buildings were cold but dry, with real floors and real roofs. Space. That was the miracle Dunkelman was betting everything on. In Bergen-Belsen, 50 people shared rooms meant for 10, creating an incubator for disease. Here, each patient got their own bed with 3 feet of space on every side. Room for air to move. Room for disease to not spread like wildfire. The test results came in after 24 hours. Of the 500 patients moved, 15 had died during or shortly after transport. That was a 3% mortality rate. Back at Bergen-Belsen main camp, 60 patients had died from the same starting group of 500 who stayed behind. Beifengeschar. Exactly as the statistics predicted. Dunkelman had just proven that moving dying people was safer than leaving them to die in place. The risk of transport was less than the certainty of the camp. Brigadier Hughes reviewed the numbers 3 times, unable to believe the stark difference. He walked through the new facility, checking on patients, talking to medical staff. The survivors were not healthy, not by any measure, but they were alive. More importantly, they were improving, away from the contaminated hell of the main camp. Basic medicine actually worked. Wounds started healing. Fevers broke. Bodies remembered how to fight. Hughes made his decision immediately. Dunkelman would get his full operation, those sense vehicles, whatever he could grab from German POW camps. 2,000 German prisoners of war would be put to work as labor, hauling supplies and setting up facilities, a fitting justice, forcing the soldiers of the regime to save its victims. 400 medical personnel would be reassigned to support the operation. The British High Command would be informed after it was already happening, because asking permission would mean delays, and delays meant death. The logistics were staggering. Dunkelman needed to move 34,000 people to 12 different locations within 8 days. That meant over 4,000 people per day. Every location needed beds, food, water, medicine, and staff. They had to convert German barracks, schoolhouses, factories, and warehouses into functioning hospitals overnight. Supplies had to be tracked down in a war-torn country. Trucks had to run constantly, and every single patient needed individual care plans. Dunkelman worked 20-hour days, sleeping in trucks between convoy runs. Fueled by adrenaline and duty, he created a system where medical care continued during transport. Nurses rode in every vehicle. Food and water were administered on schedule. Patients were monitored constantly. The trucks became moving hospitals, keeping people alive during the journey to places where they could actually recover. The first full day of operations moved 8,000 patients. The death rate dropped to 3% across all facilities, compared to the 12% dying daily in the main camp. This was a revolution. A simple, brutal, beautiful revolution built on the radical idea that sometimes saving lives meant risking lives. The medical establishment watched in stunned silence as an untrained soldier did what they said could not be done. Dunkelman did not celebrate. He was too busy planning tomorrow's routes. Censorship. 000 lives were counting on a crazy idea, working perfectly for 8 days straight. The clock was ticking, and every mistake could cost hundreds of lives. The numbers told a story that changed everything. Before Dunkelman's evacuation, Bergen-Belsen main camp recorded 400 to 500 deaths every single day. The bodies were stacked outside the medical tents each morning, a grim count that never seemed to shrink, no matter how hard the doctors worked. After the evacuation began, deaths across all 12 facilities dropped to 50 to 80 per day, an 85% reduction in mortality. 400 lives that would have been lost in just the first week were instead saved by trucks, German barracks, and one man's refusal to accept the inevitable. Over 8 days, 187 vehicles made countless trips between Bergen-Belsen and the scattered network of improvised hospitals, carrying the fragile cargo of humanity away from the abyss. Dunkelman proved that sometimes the greatest act of medicine is not a new drug, but the courage to break the rules. Dunkelman used every German truck, bus, and ambulance he could commandeer from the defeated army. An act of sheer logistical audacity. R000 German prisoners of war. Men who only weeks earlier had been fighting fiercely against the Allies, now found themselves under the command of a Jewish officer, carrying Jewish survivors on stretchers and building beds in empty warehouses. 400 medical personnel worked in shifts that blurred together into one endless, hallucinatory day of triage, transport, and treatment. The operation moved 34,000 people, the equivalent of emptying a small city, in just over a week. It was a staggering feat of improvisation. However, the British High Command did not react with praise. 3 days into the operation, Dunkelman received an urgent, icy message to report immediately to headquarters. He walked into a room full of senior officers who looked at him not as a hero, but like he had committed a crime. The atmosphere was suffocating. A general slammed his hand on a desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot, and demanded to know by what authority Dunkelman had commandeered enemy vehicles, utilized enemy prisoners for labor, and moved critically ill patients against the explicit, written advice of top medical professionals. "You are not a doctor," the general said, his voice sharp as broken glass and trembling with suppressed rage. "You have endangered lives, wasted resources, and created a logistical nightmare. We are considering court-martial for unauthorized use of enemy resources and reckless endangerment." Dunkelman stood at attention and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Technically, the general was right. He had broken rules, ignored chains of command, and made decisions far above his pay grade and authority. By every strict military standard, he deserved punishment. But by every human standard, He had saved 28. 0 lives compared to the projected death toll. The math was simple. Even if the military protocol was not, why had he done it? Because he realized that in a typhus ward, the air itself is a weapon. Concentration meant death. Dispersion meant life. He had gambled his career on that single logical deduction. Brigadier Hughes arrived at the hearing uninvited and stood beside Dunkelman. He carried a folder thick with medical reports, death certificates, and survival statistics, the cold, hard data of life and death. Hughes was a respected career officer, someone the generals could not easily dismiss. He opened his folder. The rustle of papers, the only sound in the room, and read the numbers aloud. 12% daily mortality before evacuation, 3% during and after, projected loss of 30, 0 lives by the end of May, actual loss fewer than 2, 0 so far. He looked up from his papers, locking eyes with the general. Court-martial him if you want, but do it after you explain to the world why you punished the man who saved Bergen-Belsen. The threat of court-martial faded, but it did not disappear completely. Dunkelman continued his work under a heavy cloud of official disapproval, knowing that one major mistake, one accident, would end not just the operation, but his entire military career. The tension was constant. He was walking a tightrope without a safety net. The opposition came from all sides. Traditional military hospitals and hospital ships sat waiting in ports in rear areas, pristine and useless, designed to receive stable patients who could survive standard evacuation procedures. These facilities had proper equipment, trained staff, and full medical supplies. They sat mostly empty, monuments to bureaucracy, while Dunkelman's field hospitals operated at 300% capacity in buildings that barely had running water. Medical officers wrote formal complaints, furious at the breach of protocol. Dunkelman's methods were dangerous. They argued. He was guessing, not practicing medicine. His high survival rates were attributed to luck, not skill. They warned that sooner or later, a truck would crash on the cratered roads, or a facility would be hit with an uncontrollable outbreak, and hundreds would die all at once. Then, they insisted, everyone would see that the proper, slower, more careful approach had been right all along. But the crashes did not come. The outbreaks did not spread. The death rate kept dropping. The alternative approaches proved less effective in ways that could not be argued away. Hospital ships designed for 200 patients received maybe 50 from Bergen-Belsen, all in stable condition, all requiring minimal care. Traditional evacuation to rear area hospitals took weeks to arrange, required extensive paperwork, and could only handle small numbers. By the time the proper channels processed requests and approved transports, the patients were already dead. This was the grim reality. The bureaucracy moved slower than the bacteria. Dunkelman's system was crude, chaotic, and improvised, but it was fast, and it worked. One survivor named Hadassah Rosensoft, who would later become a prominent voice for Holocaust survivors, said years afterward that the difference between the main camp and the evacuation sites was the difference between death and life. At Bergen-Belsen, we were dying with full stomachs because the disease was everywhere. In the satellite camps, we were sick, but healing, because we could breathe clean air. The young Canadian officer understood what the doctors did not. We needed space more than we needed medicine. The scale of the operation became clear only when someone tried to map all 12 locations and track the tangled supply lines. Dunkelman had created a medical network spanning 50 kilometers, connected by dirt roads and staffed by whoever was available. Some facilities were in abandoned German barracks with intact kitchens and showers. Others were in school buildings where children's desks had been pushed aside to make room for hospital beds. One site was a former factory where machines were moved out and cots were moved in. Each location received daily deliveries of food, water, medicine, and clean linens, all coordinated through a command post that Dunkelman ran from the back of a truck. The morning mist rolled across these improvised hospitals like a soft blanket. carrying the smell of disinfectant and boiled potatoes. Truck engines rumbled in the distance, a sound that became a symphony of hope, bringing the next load of patients or supplies. Yiddish prayers mixed with German commands as POWs hauled crates of medicine, and survivors strong enough to stand helped care for those still too weak to move. It was a surreal tableau, the victims and the perpetrators working in tandem to save lives. Emaciated hands clutched British Army blankets, the rough wool providing the first real warmth many had felt in years. The smell of death slowly, impossibly, began to fade, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of antiseptic and the earthy smell of real food cooking in real kitchens. Official British reports filed in May 1945 described improved medical coordination and enhanced treatment protocols at Bergen-Belsen. They mentioned new satellite facilities and better supply distribution. They credited senior medical staff with innovative approaches to typhus control and nutritional recovery. Yet, Dunkelman's name appeared nowhere in the official record. A junior Canadian officer with no medical training did not fit the narrative of professional military medicine solving an unprecedented crisis. It was an inconvenient truth, but the survivors knew. They knew the trucks that came when the doctor said moving them would kill them. They knew the young officer who walked through the facilities every day, checking on patients, yelling at supply sergeants, making sure the food arrived on time. They knew that someone had refused to let them die quietly according to the rules, and had instead broken every rule to let them live loudly, stubbornly, and against all odds. Sanchasi, 000. People knew the truth, even if the official reports did not. Weeks later, the war ended, and Dunkelman went home to Canada. He did not talk about Bergen-Belsen. When people asked about his service, he spoke of combat operations, of D-Day beaches and German towns liberated. He did not mention the trucks, or the dying, or the 8 days that saved 34. 000 lives. It was not modesty that kept him quiet. It was something deeper. Something that happens when a person sees the absolute worst of humanity and then has to live in a world that wants to forget. But the military did not forget what he had proven, even if they forgot his name. By 1950, NATO adopted mass casualty evacuation protocols based directly on Dunkelman's methods. The idea was simple, but revolutionary. When dealing with catastrophic situations where traditional medicine was failing, move people first and treat them second. Create distance between patients and the source of their suffering. Spread them out and give them space to heal. The protocols included specific guidelines. Move the sickest first. Maintain medical care during transport. Establish multiple small facilities instead of one large hospital. These were Dunkelman's innovations, now written into official military doctrine. The Korean War tested these new protocols within months of their adoption. When UN forces retreated south in winter 1950, they faced thousands of wounded soldiers and refugees in desperate conditions. Medical officers remembered Bergen-Belsen, even if they did not remember who had solved it. They evacuated en masse, moving entire field hospitals overnight, treating patients in vehicles and trains and ships. The survival rates shocked traditional military doctors who still believed that moving the critically ill was a death sentence. Dunkelman's approach had become standard practice, the new orthodoxy replacing the old. Vietnam saw the same methods applied with helicopters instead of trucks. Wounded soldiers were pulled from jungles and evacuated within minutes to facilities far from combat zones. MASH units became mobile by design, ready to pack up and relocate whenever the tactical situation demanded. The population health approach, treating groups instead of individuals, saving lives through logistics instead of just medicine, became the foundation of modern combat medicine. Every medevac helicopter, every mobile surgical unit, every rapid evacuation protocol carried echoes of 8 days. In April 1945, when a Canadian officer proved that sometimes the best medicine is a fast truck and an empty building, modern refugee crises adopted the same framework. When camps became overcrowded and disease spread faster than treatment, aid organizations learned to create satellite facilities and spread populations across wider areas. the World Health Organization published guidelines for epidemic response that emphasized rapid patient movement away from contamination sources. Dunkelman's fingerprints were on every page, though his name appeared nowhere in the citations. Back in Toronto, Dunkelman built a successful business career and raised a family. He was active in the Jewish community, supported Israel, and lived a quiet, prosperous life. For nearly 40 years, he barely mentioned Bergen-Belsen. When he did speak of it, his voice was flat and factual, describing logistics and death rates as if reading from a distant report about someone else's life. The emotional weight of those 8 days stayed locked inside, too heavy to share with people who had not been there. In the 1980s, Holocaust survivors began organizing reunions and memorial events. Some who had been at Bergen-Belsen started asking questions. Who was the young Canadian officer who had organized the evacuation? Who was the man who had commandeered the trucks and set up the satellite camps? Who had fought with the British command to save them when the doctors said they could not be saved? The search led them to Dunkelman, now an elderly man who seemed surprised that anyone remembered or cared. The survivors remembered everything. They remembered being carried to trucks when they could not walk. They remembered blankets and warm food and the miracle of clean air in buildings that did not reek of death. They remembered a young officer with dark circles under his eyes who checked on them personally, who yelled at supply sergeants in multiple languages, who treated them like human beings worth saving instead of problems too difficult to solve. They wanted to thank him. They wanted the world to know his name. Dunkelman agreed to speak at Holocaust remembrance events. His talks were brief and uncomfortable, a soldier's report rather than a speaker's performance. He spoke of numbers and logistics, of trucks and barracks and food rations. He avoided drama, refused to make himself a hero, and deflected praise back to the medical staff and volunteers who had done the actual work of caring for patients. But the survivors knew better. The medical staff had been there before Dunkelman arrived, following protocols, while 400 people died daily. The change, the revolution, the salvation had come from one man's refusal to accept expert opinion when expert opinion meant death. Israel honored him in 1997, long after most of the world had moved on to other stories. The recognition came quietly, without the fanfare given to military heroes or famous rescuers. Canada took even longer to acknowledge what one of its soldiers had accomplished. The official military history mentioned Bergen-Belsen's liberation, but gave Dunkelman a single sentence, a footnote in someone else's story. The lesson of Bergen-Belsen was not about one man's heroism. It was about the deadly comfort of orthodoxy. The British doctors who said moving patients would kill them were not wrong because they were bad doctors. They were wrong because they were good doctors, following good protocols in a situation where good was not good enough. They had textbooks and training, and decades of medical science supporting their position. Dunkelman had only the evidence of his own eyes and the willingness to be spectacularly wrong if it meant a chance to be miraculously right. Sometimes the rules that exist to save lives become the barriers that prevent saving lives. Sometimes expertise becomes a prison where new ideas cannot breathe. Sometimes the most important thing a person can do is look at the impossible situation, ignore everyone who explains why nothing can be done, and do it anyway. Dunkelman was not smarter than the medical experts. He was not braver than the soldiers who had fought across Europe. He was simply willing to be called crazy if crazy was what it took to keep 34,000 people alive. History loves to remember the dramatic moments, yet it often forgets the quiet, stubborn logic that actually saves the world. History books show us the triumphant opening of gates, the tears of joy as camps were finally liberated. But we must ask, was freedom truly enough? Liberation is never just a singular. It is a brutal, agonizing process. It becomes a desperate race involving trucks, commandeered barracks, and calculated rations. Thousands of logistical gambles, where a single delay meant the difference between surviving freedom or tragically dying from it. Ben Dunkelman understood a terrifying truth. Simply opening the gates was a death sentence if left unmanaged. Why? Because starving bodies cannot wait for bureaucracy. Someone had to ensure those walking skeletons survived long enough to reclaim a stolen future. 34,000 lives hung in the balance during 8 white-knuckle days in April. Here, military protocol clashed with moral urgency, and protocol lost. This is the harrowing lesson of Bergen-Belsen. It reveals the legacy of one Canadian soldier who dared to defy orders. True heroism isn't just about saving people. It is having the audacity to be wrong by every military measure except the one that truly matters. We measure success by lives continuing, by hearts kept beating against the odds, and by bodies healing in clean sanctuaries rather than rotting in contaminated filth. By that vital metric, Dunkelman was never crazy. In a world that had descended into total madness, he remained the only sane man left.